Hey there. Welcome to another late-night ramble through the back alleys of boring history, where we turn the strange, the smelly, and the downright uncomfortable into cozy sleep stories for grown-ups. Picture this. Darkness pressing in on a Viking longhouse. Snow piling up outside and inside. Well, let's just say you're about to find out why communal living isn't always as charming as it sounds. And stick around, because later on, I'll let you in on a Viking survival secret that even their fiercest warriors found a little questionable. Now, if you end up enjoying this little midnight tour through weird history, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if it sparks some joy. I'm not here to pressure anyone. Jump into the comments and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love seeing sleepy folks checking in from every corner of the planet. Dim those lights, fluff your pillow, maybe crack a window if you want the full Viking air experience, and settle in. This is your invitation to a bedtime story, straight out of survival mode, Viking style. So, let's set the scene. It's deep winter in Scandinavia, which pretty much means the sun has checked out, the wind is howling, and stepping outside feels a bit like getting slapped by an ice giant. Central heating? Not even a rumor yet. The Vikings, experts in making do, simply shrugged, grumbled, and retreated into their sturdy, squat longhouses. These weren't just homes. They were fortress bunkers, designed to do one thing: keep you, your family, and your livestock on the right side of frozen. If you're imagining some grand wooden lodge, scale it way back. Viking longhouses were low, wide, and looked like someone tried to build a gymnasium out of driftwood and peat moss. Timber was the go-to if you were lucky enough to live near a forest. For those out on the windy, treeless plains, turf and stone were the building blocks, think eco-friendly, but mostly because you had no other choice. The roof sloped down almost to the ground, forming a sort of cozy, muddy hug for the whole structure. Privacy? Forget it. Airflow? Only if you count the perpetual draft sneaking in around the door, which, by the way, might have been held in place by a handy femur or two. But really, the magic of the Viking winter wasn't in the walls, it was in the bodies. Human bodies, animal bodies, and the ever-present, slightly wheezing fire pit. Imagine your living room transformed into a kind of communal oven, the heat powered by sweat, snoring relatives, and an assortment of livestock that had no say in the matter. The longhouse worked as a giant thermal battery. The more bodies you packed in, human or otherwise, the warmer it got. Modern architects might call this passive heating. Vikings called it not dying. The fire pit ran right down the center of the room, blazing away day and night. There was no chimney, unless you count a hole in the roof or the wishful thinking that smoke would find its own way out. Mostly, it didn't. Smoke rose and gathered in the rafters, painting the beams black and giving everyone's lungs a permanent lining of charcoal. If you think your allergies are bad now, try living in a house where every breath is a little taste of barbecue. It wasn't so much ventilation as it was resignation. You'd come out of winter alive, but smelling like a smoked ham, and with a cough that doubled as a family surname. Sleeping arrangements were a study in togetherness, whether you liked it or not. Raised platforms lined the walls, piled with straw, moss, and whatever else could be scrounged up and didn't immediately catch fire. Whole families, plus a goat or two, curled up side by side. It wasn't about bonding. It was about survival. Warmth wasn't a luxury. It was a group project. Privacy was just a rumor passed down by the truly delusional. If you were lucky enough to have a blanket, you guarded it with the same intensity you'd reserve for your last hunk of dried fish. Let's talk about the real VIPs of the Viking longhouse, the animals. In the dead of winter, cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and even chickens were ushered inside. Not for companionship, though some chickens do have surprisingly warm personalities. but for sheer, unfiltered heat. Your average cow throws off as much warmth as a space heater, minus the risk of electrical fires, but with a much higher risk of stepping in something unpleasant. The livestock were herded into the byre, a sectioned-off area at one end of the house, though sectioned off is generous. A low wall or a row of stones might keep the cows from joining you in bed, but not from contributing their own special aroma to the atmosphere. On the very coldest nights, the boundaries between human and animal blurred. Children might snuggle up next to a sheep if the family's ox seemed particularly warm and stationary. Congratulations. You just gained a large, slightly furry pillow. It wasn't cuddly, but it was effective. The logic was simple. Animals are radiators that feed themselves. And in a world without insulation or thermostats, you took every watt of warmth you could get, even if it meant your pajamas smelled like barn. Of course, this arrangement came with a few minor downsides. The soundtrack to Viking winter was a symphony of snorting, bleating, and the occasional startled yelp from someone who rolled over a chicken. And the smell. Let's just say Febreze hadn't made it to Scandinavia yet. But hey, if it kept you alive, you learned to breathe through your mouth and count your blessings. Vikings had a saying, warmth now, dignity later. Actually, they probably didn't, but it's the kind of motto that fits. The architecture of these longhouses wasn't just haphazard. There was a method to the madness. Builders intentionally designed the space to channel warmth from the byre toward the living quarters, turning livestock into living space heaters and security systems in one. If a wolf tried to snatch your favorite goat, you'd know about it before the goat did. It was multi-purpose design, practical, efficient, and unapologetically fragrant. Now, if you're picturing medieval Hygge, let me stop you right there. These houses were packed, smoky, and the opposite of tranquil. But they did what they were supposed to do, keep everyone, human and animal, alive through a winter that could last half the year, and make you question your life choices, at least twice before breakfast. Viking fashion was all about survival, not style. Forget about runway looks, unless the runway is covered in black ice and smells faintly of cheese. The Norse knew a thing or two about layering. Their philosophy was simple. If you can still bend your knees, you're not wearing enough wool. The first layer was linen, if you could afford it. Linen was great for wicking away sweat, but it was expensive and didn't last long, so most folks started with wool, lots of wool. Viking men wore tunics over trousers, with leg wraps that can only be described as the ancient world's answer to thermal leggings. Women wore long woolen dresses, aprons, and heavy cloaks. Everyone belted up, not for fashion, but to keep their clothes from falling off, and to store essentials like knives, flint, or a last resort snack. Cloaks were the Viking version of a winter coat, fastened with brooches and often lined with fur, if you were fancy. No cloak? Then you were probably not long for this world. Boots were crafted from animal hides, cattle if you had them, seals if you lived closer to the coast, and sealed up tight with animal fat. Stylish? No. Effective? Absolutely. The trade-off was smelling like a smoked sausage every time you left the house. For those who took winter prep seriously, there was always the option to go full Viking MacGyver and make waterproof layers out of animal intestines. Yes, you heard that right. Cleaned, scraped, dried, and sewn together, these proto-raincoats were the real deal. Not breathable, not glamorous, but you could walk through a snowstorm and stay dry, as long as you didn't mind looking and smelling like you'd lost a fight with a butcher shop. Accessories rounded out the look. Hats, mittens, and scarves were all made from felted wool, beaten to submission until it was dense enough to fend off the wind. If you didn't have gloves, you simply tucked your hands into your cloak and tried to ignore the creeping numbness. Fashion was about survival. If you showed up to breakfast missing a few toes, you learned to dress warmer next time. But clothes and houses only got you so far. To truly beat the cold, you needed fuel. And by fuel, I mean food. Viking winter cuisine was, let's say, aggressively practical. Calories weren't a luxury. They were your insulation, your central heating, and your best hope for surviving until the sun remembered how to rise. The menu was whatever you could store, preserve, or catch. Meat, dairy, grains, and an almost alarming amount of preserved fish. Let's start with the fish. It was smoked, salted, dried, even fermented. They made lutefisk, which involved soaking whitefish in lye until it reached the consistency of something between dinner and a dare. Not delicious, but immune to spoilage and, frankly, a test of character. If you could eat it, you could survive anything. Stews were the backbone of Viking cuisine. Every day, a pot hung over the hearth, bubbling with whatever scraps of meat, roots, oats, or even sour milk had survived the last inventory. The longer it simmered, the thicker it got. By the end of winter, the stew might be closer to a solid than a liquid, but it kept you full, and that's what mattered. Dairy was a year-round staple, but it really came into play during winter. Cheese and butter were made in the summer, then hoarded like edible treasure. Forget brie or camembert, this was survival cheese. Hard, salty, and so dense you could use it as a weapon. Vikings also made skyr, a cross between yogurt and cheese, so tart it could wake you up better than a bucket of snow. It was high in protein and, let's be honest, an acquired taste. Grains were stored by the barrel, barley and rye, mostly. They formed the base for flatbreads and porridge. Viking bread was heavy, dark, and sometimes stretched with ground-up tree bark. It wasn't winning any bake-offs, but it kept your stomach from growling loud enough to attract wolves. And of course, the Vikings didn't forget alcohol. Ale and mead were staples, not just for parties, but for daily survival. Mead, in particular, helped you forget that you were living in a smoke-filled animal shelter with your in-laws and someone else's goat. So, with all these cozy details, you might imagine the Vikings just snuggled up, ate their questionable cheese, and waited for spring. But winter in a longhouse was about more than just surviving the cold. It was about surviving each other too. Huddling for warmth wasn't just practical, it was the only option. Whole families, plus dogs, cats, and whatever else wandered in, piled onto the sleeping platforms. Children nestled between parents. Elders were treated like portable space heaters. And even the family mutt got a prime spot if it had enough body fat to share. There was no shame in using your neighbor's elbow as a pillow, though you might want to avoid Aunt Astrid's feet. Privacy, that was still a myth. Comfort was a long-lost legend, but the warmth was real, and so was the sense of community. Everyone breathed the same smoky air, endured the same animal symphony, and counted the days until the snow melted, or someone invented windows that actually closed. If someone snored, you learned to sleep through it, or at least to retaliate with a well-aimed hunk of cheese. But the real test wasn't just the cold, it was the isolation. Winter could last so long, you'd forget the world outside your longhouse even existed. That's when the Vikings turned to humor, stories, and the occasional roast of each other, not just dinner. Sagas were told and retold, often featuring heroes who met their end in spectacularly chilly fashion. Jokes flew, always sharp, sometimes brutal, and everyone took turns at being the punchline. Nothing beat back the winter blues, quite like a little friendly mockery, or a story about your cousin falling into the latrine last week. Feasts were a big deal too. When supplies allowed, families would break out their best hoarded food for midwinter celebrations, not just to mark the festival of Yule, but to remind each other that, against all odds, they'd made it through another season. Games, riddles, and the occasional wrestling match broke up the monotony. If you knocked over a sheep during a contest, no one held it against you, unless you spilled the mead. At the heart of it all was a simple truth. Vikings didn't expect comfort. They expected winter to be hard, life to be uncomfortable, and survival to be a group effort. Misery was standard. Anything better was a pleasant surprise. In the end, what kept them going was a stubborn refusal to give up, and the knowledge that spring, eventually, would come back around. So, as you drift off tonight, picture yourself tucked in among the straw and the wool, surrounded by snoring relatives and a couple of disgruntled goats. The fire is low, the smoke is thick, and somewhere outside, the snow keeps falling. But inside there's warmth, messy, noisy, and maybe a little fragrant, but warmth all the same. Next up, we're diving deeper into the world of Viking insulation and their unique approach to sleeping arrangements, not to mention the wild midwinter festival of Yule. Insulation as we know it today involves fiberglass, foam, or other high-tech materials with catchy brand names and warning labels. But for the Vikings, cozy was a whole different animal, sometimes literally. Stick around and we'll peel back the layers on exactly how they managed to stay warm when the world was frozen solid. It's just after midnight on our imaginary Viking radio dial, and tonight's episode of Boring History for Sleep is brought to you by the fine people who invented stuffing moss into the walls and calling it insulation. Settle back, let the darkness outside your window settle in, and picture this. You're a Viking, and winters come knocking. Forget double-glazed windows that snugly foam in your attic, and especially any Instagrammable home reno. Viking insulation was more of a grab whatever's not actively moving and jam it in the cracks kind of operation. Your longhouse isn't drafty because someone forgot how to build. It's drafty by plan, sort of. These timber and turf palaces were, in their own way, masterpieces of survival engineering. If you lived anywhere near a forest, you'd chop down some trees and stack the logs for your walls. If you were out on the windswept plains, you went with stone and slabs of turf, the kind that still had a few stubborn weeds clinging on for dear life. Sometimes, those walls were so thick you could lose a small child in them, up to a meter, if you want the full Viking experience. Now, between those logs or chunks of stone, the only rule was, if it's fibrous and smells even a little warm, it's going in. Moss was a favorite. Straw, mud, animal hair, and, let's be honest, whatever was lying around, all got pressed into service. It was insulation by committee, and nobody was too picky about the details. If you leaned up against the wall barefoot, you'd probably regret it. But that's what boots are for. And the roof. Today we call it green roofing, and charge extra for it. Back then, it was just survival. Sod roofs were layers of grass and dirt, sometimes sprouting mushrooms or the occasional weed. Not exactly a salad bar. But if you're hungry and desperate, you start rethinking your relationship with fungi. These turf roofs weren't just a quirky design choice. They kept heat in, rain out, and under the right conditions, provided a little bonus indoor gardening. If you ever hear someone bragging about their eco-friendly home, just remember, the Vikings did it first, and with less complaining. Take a look at the floor. Picture it, packed earth, maybe covered with straw or rushes if you were feeling fancy. Of course, you'd swap that straw out every so often, usually prompted by the moment when the smell transitioned from authentic countryside to something died under the bed. Rustic charm, Viking edition. Now, windows were another story. If you're imagining big, bright spaces with sunlight streaming in, think again. Glass was expensive, and drafts were deadly. The only windows you'd find in a Viking longhouse were tiny slits, if you were lucky. Natural light was considered optional, especially when it's pitch black for months at a time. Light came from the fire, and a few strategically placed smoke holes. That's right, smoke holes. Because what's a little indoor pollution between friends? And yet, against all odds, these homes worked. The crazy patchwork of timber, turf, moss, and the occasional wayward goat hair turned a longhouse into what can only be described as a slow cooker of body heat. Throw in a family or two, maybe some livestock, and you've got yourself a Scandinavian sauna with bonus protein. It wasn't a spa. It wasn't breathable. You'd never get it past a modern building inspector. But it kept people alive, warmish, and just smoky enough to discourage bugs and preserve the occasional fish. If you're looking for the origins of weird history, or the ultimate sleep story, it's right here, huddled together under a mountain of moss and hoping the thatch doesn't leak. Now, let's talk about sleep, the real Viking kind. Forget everything you know about personal space, privacy, or even the concept of a bedroom. The Viking approach was more like thermal mass strategy, with everyone you know and a few you wish you didn't. Sleeping arrangements were communal and, let's just say, aggressively practical. Picture this. The inside of your longhouse is lined with raised wooden platforms running along the walls. On top, there's a thick layer of straw or moss with every scrap of fur and wool you can find thrown on top. If it's soft and doesn't bite, it's bedding. No sheets, no duvets, no monogrammed pillowcases, just layers and layers of whatever you could get your hands on. And you slept in your clothes, all of them, if you could manage it. Pajamas. That's a good way to become a Viking popsicle. Boots sometimes stayed on, because frostbite has no respect for dignity. The real sleep story here is survival, not style. Infants were bundled tight and held close. Kids were wedged between parents or siblings, not for the cuddle factor, but because insulation is best when it's family-sized. You want the warmth. You get the crowd. Couples slept together, and then whoever else could fit joined in. Modesty took a back seat to not freezing. If someone's feet wandered during the night, that wasn't scandal. It was strategy. At this point, you were less a family and more a human meatloaf, baked to perfection by body heat and wool. If you had a cloak, you used it. If you had animal hides, especially from reindeer or bear, you were either wealthy, lucky, or very brave in the woods. For the overachievers among us, or the folks with a little more silver in their pockets, heated stones or bricks went under the bedding. Basically, the Viking version of a hot water bottle, only heavier and more likely to leave a scorch mark on your thigh. If the fire went out in the hearth, nobody jumped up to relight it. You just pulled someone closer and muttered a warning in ancient Norse that probably translated to, "If you steal my fur again, we're done." There was a 100% chance of snoring. The air was smoky, cramped, and thick with the scent of sweat, wool, and last night's stew. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. You didn't breathe fresh air in a Viking longhouse. You breathed well-marinated air, slow-cooked all winter. By the time midnight rolled around, your lungs felt like they'd smoked a ham, and so did the ham hanging from the rafters. But here's the weird history twist. All that smoke had a purpose. Sure, it made you cough. Sure, the ceiling turned darker than a Norse god's mood. But the smoke drifting through the house actually helped preserve meats and fish. It kept bugs at bay and slowed down mold. It was like living inside a giant communal smokehouse. If you were lucky enough to live in a fancier home, you might have a proper vent in the roof to let the worst of it out. For everyone else, the ambience was just another part of Viking life. Of course, some tried to outsmart the smoke. A few families built platforms to sleep higher up, hoping to avoid the thickest haze. Others kept close to the floor, thinking maybe the air would be cleaner down low. Spoiler, it wasn't. Physics is cruel, and smoke always finds its way to your nostrils. And when things got too smoky, you had two choices: open the door and freeze, or tough it out and let your eyes water along with everyone else. It was a toss-up. Either way, you'd end the night smelling like a bonfire with feet. Now, as the long winter dragged on and the sun took a well-deserved vacation, Vikings turned to their most powerful survival strategy of all, the Yule Festival. Forget seasonal depression. If you keep everyone busy eating, drinking, and yelling around a fire, nobody has time to freeze. Yule was midwinter's answer to, what do we do when the night never ends? It was equal parts survival tactic, spiritual tradition, and the ultimate excuse to empty the pantry. The festival kicked off around the winter solstice, when daylight was in short supply and spirits needed a boost. Yule could last days, or even weeks, depending entirely on how much mead was left. This wasn't just a party, it was a psychological lifeline. It gave everyone something to anticipate, besides not dying of hypothermia. Families came together. Livestock was sacrificed, both for blessings and, yes, also for dinner. And gigantic fires were lit to tempt the sun back from wherever it was hiding. The bonfires weren't cute little campfires either. These were blazing infernos that dared the darkness to come any closer. Food was everywhere. Preserved meats, stews, ale, mead. If it was edible and not yet moldy, it made it to the table. People told stories, played games, and sang songs that probably sounded like a cross between a war chant and someone trying to scare off the wind. The Yule log, nowadays a dessert or a Pinterest project, was originally just a massive log meant to burn for days. It stood for warmth, for continuity, and for the very practical goal of not freezing your family into Viking statues. Of course, there was a supernatural side to Yule too. Winter was the season when spirits, trolls, and restless ancestors were thought to roam freely. Rituals, charms, and the odd offering were made to keep the peace, and to keep your goats from being spirited away. If you're wondering where modern Christmas traditions got their roots, look no further. Evergreens, feasting, gifts, even dragging a tree indoors, all given the Norse stamp of approval first. Through it all, Yule was about more than just survival. It was about finding joy in the darkest months, with nothing but fire, food, and the company of people who, just a few hours earlier, you'd been elbowing for space on the communal mattress. No light switches, no vitamin D supplements, and not even a word for seasonal affective disorder. Just resilience, stubborn cheer, and a belief that the sun would eventually return. And if it didn't, at least you'd go out with a full belly and a story worth telling. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, tucked under your modern comforter, maybe remember the Vikings, masters of good enough, insulation, champions of the group nap, and inventors of the midwinter blowout. Their weird history is our sleep story, and maybe, just maybe, it'll help you fall asleep fast tonight. And speaking of woolly tales, our next chapter will unravel the secret to Viking survival in winter, how a simple sheep's coat became more valuable than gold. In Viking Age Scandinavia, gold was nice, silver was better, but wool was life. Let's slip right into that next bedtime story. Let's set the scene. It's a pitch-black January night, somewhere in Viking Age Scandinavia. Snow has piled up against the walls. The wind howls like a banshee, and the air outside is so cold, your nose hairs could probably snap off if you dared to step outside. But inside the longhouse, there's a different world. A world built on three things: wool, grit, and a sense of humor that might be the only thing standing between you and total frostbite. Now, you've probably heard of Viking gold or silver. Those shiny bits archaeologists love to drool over. But ask any Norse farmer what real treasure looked like, and they'd point you straight to their sheep. Wool wasn't just a material. It was the ancient world's version of central heating, Netflix binge blanket, and family inheritance all rolled into one. If you were lucky, you had a cloak woven so thick it could double as a portable hut, Every Viking's greatest weapon against winter was, without question, wool. Well, wool, and maybe the willingness to snuggle up with a sheep or two, assuming you didn't mind the smell of wet livestock and a faint whiff of regret. Wool was everywhere. The stuff was spun, woven, stitched, and layered into cloaks, tunics, socks, mittens, hats, underclothes, and enough blankets to insulate a small fortress. If you could dream it, someone had probably already made it out of wool, usually with a design aesthetic best described as whatever keeps me alive the longest. Unlike cotton, which turns traitor the instant it gets wet, wool was loyal. It kept its warmth even when it was damp, which is exactly as often as you'd expect in a place where the sky specialized in freezing fog and gentle sleet that could peel paint. Raising sheep was a household obsession, but not for their adorable faces or future cheese potential. No, it was all about that glorious, itchy fleece. Spinning wool wasn't a hobby. It was a year-round job, the kind of work that fell to women and children as soon as they could be trusted not to tangle themselves in the spinning wheel. In winter, spinning felt a little like building your own survival kit, one thread at a time. Every twist of the spindle was another degree of warmth banked against the coming storm. Vikings didn't do fashion for fun, but if you saw a group of them trudging through the snow, you might be surprised by how tailored they looked. Tunics were cut to fit, cloaks shaped for movement, and leg wraps bound so tightly you could probably scale a glacier without tripping over yourself. In the Viking world, form always followed function, and if you stayed warm doing it, even better. The quality of your wool gear said a lot about you. Coarse, scratchy wool meant you were practical, or maybe just broke. But if you managed to get your hands on soft, tightly woven wool, that was basically the medieval version of a designer hoodie. Wealthy folks could even afford dyed wool in colors, like blue or red, sometimes imported at great expense. Everyone else? Let's just say they wore the full range of sheep chic, a glorious palette of beige, grey, and off-white. Then there was felt, the unsung hero of Viking textiles. This wasn't your grandma's gentle craft project. Viking felt was wool that had been soaked, stomped, pounded, and generally abused until it fused into a windproof, waterproof, nearly indestructible mat. This miracle fabric was used for hats, mittens, boots, and, in a pinch, to insulate the walls of your home. Imagine making fabric out of rage, foot sweat, and pure survival instinct. That's Viking felt, and it worked. Every scrap of wool was precious. Garments were patched, repaired, and handed down for generations, unless they got torched, blown away, or were buried with you as your going-away outfit. Even leftover bits were rewoven into socks or stuffed into cushions. There was no such thing as waste, unless you counted the odd sock the dog ran off with. But here's where it gets really weird. Vikings were, if nothing else, enthusiastic about getting even colder on purpose. I know, it sounds like the setup to a bad sleep story, but stick with me here. The Vikings had a thing for saunas and ice baths. Yes, you heard that right. When the outside world was one giant ice tray, some Norse folk would strip down and sit in a sweat lodge, known as a badstuffer, where red-hot stones were doused with water to fill the air with steam. Picture yourself sitting, half naked, sweating like a berserker at a summer feast, while outside the wind is busy sculpting icicles on your roof. But that was only half the fun. After your steam bath, you might run outside and dive straight into an ice-cold stream, or roll around in the snow. Why? Well, partly for health reasons, but mostly to prove to yourself, the gods, and any nosy neighbors that you were tough enough to laugh in winter's frosty face. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who has never heard of Netflix or heated floors. These hot and cold rituals weren't just some macho display of Viking bravado. They had practical benefits too. Sweating in the sauna helped cleanse the body. At least, It made you feel like you were doing something about the fact that you hadn't had a proper bath in weeks. The sudden temperature shifts boosted circulation, cleared sinuses, and for a few blissful moments, made you forget you lived in a world without insulation or ibuprofen. There was a social side to it as well. Saunas were communal, meaning families or even entire villages would sweat and freeze together, not just for ritual, but for bonding, gossip, and the occasional bit of competitive endurance. Steam rooms also doubled as birthing centers, healing spaces, and the closest thing to a hospital you could find in the 9th century. If you needed to fix something, heat it up or flush it out, the Viking solution was simple. Cook it first, then freeze it for good measure. And if you're wondering whether these traditions stuck around, just ask anyone in modern Scandinavia about their sauna habits. The only real difference now is they usually leave the goats outside. Of course, surviving the cold was only half the battle. The real enemy was boredom. When the night stretched on for months, the ground froze solid, and your favorite hobby, raiding, was on hold. You had to get creative to avoid going stir-crazy or strangling your relatives. Winter meant long hours indoors, surrounded by the same faces, the same smells, and the same questionable cuisine. Think of it as the world's original escape room, only with more livestock and fewer clues. The first order of business was repairs and preparation. Winter was prime time for sharpening weapons, mending tools, restringing bows, and patching up anything that had suffered during the year. If your tunic had a hole in October, you could bet it was being sewn by candlelight in December, unless you enjoyed frostbite in places best left unmentioned. Spinning and weaving took up a big chunk of the day. Women, children, and anyone with hands that weren't frozen solid spent hours turning wool into yarn, and yarn into something resembling clothing. It wasn't glamorous, but you knew every stitch was another layer between you and an early, extremely chilly grave. But Vikings weren't robots. They craved a little creativity to break up the monotony. Winter was when practical needs met artistry, wood carving, bone tools, antler combs. These weren't just chores. They were chances to make something beautiful, or at least something less ugly than last year's attempt. The longhouse might have looked bleak from the outside, but inside it was alive with the soft clatter of tools, the muttered curses of someone who dropped a needle, and the low hum of people quietly trying to outlast the darkness. And then there was storytelling. Forget Netflix. Vikings had sagas. These epic oral tales, spun by firelight, told of gods, monsters, heroes, and the kind of relatives you only see at weddings and funerals. Each retelling got a little longer, a little wilder. Thor didn't just defeat giants. He probably punched the moon for good measure, at least by the 4th cup of mead. Storytelling was the glue that held the community together. It made the dark seem a little brighter, the cold a little less sharp. Games were another way to pass the time. Vikings played board games like Nefatafel, which made chess look like a stroll in the park. There were dice games that combined luck, bluffing, and a healthy dose of creative cheating. Some families would even hold mock duels or riddle contests when things got really desperate. And, of course, alcohol helped. Mead made the stories funnier, the games rowdier, and family squabbles just a bit more entertaining for anyone watching from the sidelines. But beyond the wool, the rituals, and the indoor marathons of crafting and storytelling, the Vikings' real secret weapon was their mindset. And no, I'm not talking about motivational posters or hang in there kittens. I mean the kind of deep, unbreakable stubbornness that comes from centuries of living in a place where winter tries to kill you every year. For Vikings, winter wasn't a tragedy or a surprise. It was just part of the calendar, right up there with planting season and the annual Visit France and Set It on Fire. Trip. They didn't dread winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and met it with the emotional equivalent of a shrug and a sarcastic joke about how at least it wasn't tax season. Viking culture trained people from birth to see hardship as a test, not a punishment. Cold, pain, and hunger weren't failures. They were character development. You didn't complain. You endured. Sometimes with a grimace. Sometimes with a joke about how this was still better than dealing with your in-laws. This wasn't just cultural either. It was spiritual. Norse mythology is basically a highlight reel of frost giants, endless winters, and gods who treat suffering like it's a fun Tuesday night activity. When your belief system includes a literal end-of-the-world event called Fimbulwinter, an endless freeze that destroys the world, you stop flinching at a little snow. This mental toughness wasn't just a personal trait, it was a community value. Weakness wasn't mocked, it was simply ignored. Nobody wanted to be the person who couldn't handle the dark or the cold, so everyone learned to push through, to stay busy, and to find something, anything, to laugh about. People kept working, kept joking about the weather, and poured another mug of mead while sewing their 43rd mitten. Even children were taught to tough it out from early on. If your fingers were cold, use your elbows. If your toes went numb, walk faster. If you fell through the ice and lived, congratulations. You just earned yourself a starring role in the next family saga. Was it the healthiest approach? Probably not. Effective? Unquestionably. Modern survival manuals love to preach about the power of mindset. But the Vikings didn't need a manual. They'd already figured it out. Winter wasn't an enemy to defeat, but a test to meet head-on. And they passed it more times than they could count. That's how they survived the coldest nights, with wool, fire, a healthy dose of sarcasm, and a psychological middle finger raised high against the wind. And as the longhouse settles for the night, with the fire crackling low, the stories winding down, and the sheep snoring gently in the corner, you start to realize something. The real warmth wasn't just in the wool or the fire, but in the way people survived together, laughing, enduring, and out-stubborning the winter year after year. Which brings us, sleepy listeners, to the next piece in our chilly saga. If there's one thing the Vikings understood better than most, it was this. The Vikings had carved this lesson into their icy bones. Surviving winter was never a solo act. You could be wrapped up in the world's fluffiest cloak, lounging beside the plumpest sheep in Scandinavia. And still, without your community, you were just another cold soul shivering in the dark. Accessorized, but alone. Viking survival wasn't about rugged individualism. It was about sticking together, preferably as close to the communal fire as humanly possible, even when you had to share that fire with a cousin who snored like a thunderstorm. Picture a typical Viking settlement, not isolated farmhouses dotting a snowy wasteland, but clusters of families, sometimes dozens of people, banded together in a kind of proto-neighborhood watch. There were no picket fences, unless you count the ones designed to keep cows from joining you in bed. When the winter wind started howling, it was your neighbors, your kin, and every able-bodied soul within shouting distance who became your lifeline. Food wasn't just hoarded by one family. It was pooled, rationed, and sometimes argued over with the kind of diplomacy usually reserved for modern office potlucks. If someone's roof gave way under the weight of yet another blizzard, you didn't just shrug and wish them luck. You grabbed your tools and got to work, because next week it could be your turn. Sickness in the dead of winter was practically a group activity. If a child caught a fever, someone would show up with herbs, a half-remembered prayer, or at the very least an encouraging grunt and a warning about licking icicles. There was no room for heroics. This wasn't about being a generous neighbor for the sake of a thank you basket. It was cold, hard arithmetic. The more people you kept alive until spring, the more hands you had for planting, fighting, or holding down a particularly enthusiastic goat during shearing season. Even if you had to share your last hunk of smoked fish with that one in-law who always forgets to help with firewood, you did it. Because winter had a way of reminding everyone that selfishness was just a more complicated way to starve. The real glue came during the long, dark midwinter celebrations. Think feasts like Yule, where the ale flowed. The storytelling lasted until dawn, and the philosophy was equal parts profound and slightly tipsy. These weren't just holidays. They were survival strategy disguised as a party. Every shared story, every badly told saga, every communal toast was another thread in the social net, holding everyone above the snowdrifts. Even the way they stored supplies revealed this survival by committee. Communal granaries, shared smokehouses, and meat lockers weren't just for convenience. If one family's stores ran dry, the others would pitch in, not because it was polite, but because a hungry neighbor in January could become everyone's problem by February. Leadership mattered too. Chieftains, priests, and those who could shout loudest at the thing weren't just there to settle squabbles or hand out cryptic advice. Their job was logistics as much as law. A respected leader was one who could resolve disputes over a borrowed goat and also organize a firewood collection so nobody froze to death in their sleep. If justice was swift, social pressure was even swifter. Try hoarding food or slacking on your chores, and the collective side-eye from your entire village would deliver a chill no blanket could fix. In Viking society, public shaming was almost as fearsome as frostbite, maybe worse, since at least frostbite didn't talk about you behind your back. Now, imagine the end of a typical Viking winter. The wind still rattles the thatch, livestock is still snoring in the corner, and your clothes still smell faintly of smoke and defeat. But something remarkable has happened. The Vikings didn't just muddle through, they transformed winter into a kind of annual boot camp. Every layer of scratchy wool, every smoky breath, every grim joke told around the hearth was another notch in the belt of endurance. Winter wasn't just a season. It was that relentless opponent everyone trained for. If the longhouse was drafty, you stuffed the gaps with moss. If the stew was thin, you bulked it up with root vegetables until it became more glue than soup. If the nights stretched on forever, you filled them with stories, games, and, when all else failed, a good-natured wrestling match between cousins that doubled as a heat source. Central heating? Not even a dream. So they built fire pits big enough to smoke out a bear. Waterproof jackets. They made proto-raincoats out of sheep's wool, lanolin, and sheer stubbornness. Modern antidepressants. Forget it. They had sagas. The occasional mead binge, and a style of dark humor so sharp it could make seasonal depression think twice. While other societies hibernated or complained, the Vikings used winter to get stronger. Weapons were repaired. Children were trained in every skill from swordplay to sheep wrangling, and new ideas, sometimes brilliant, sometimes questionable, were hatched beside the ever-present hearth. When spring finally broke through the snow, Vikings didn't stumble out, blinking and dazed. They leapt into action, ready to farm, build, make alliances, or, let's be honest, go raid a monastery or two in search of finer things, and maybe a slightly less pungent wardrobe. Winter didn't wear them down. It sharpened them, toughened them, and left them more inventive than ever. Their secret wasn't magic or divine favor. It was grit, a slightly smoky sense of humor, and an unbreakable commitment to getting through the darkest months together, even if it meant sleeping under a goat, steaming in a cramped hut, or eating yogurt that could double as home repair putty. So, as you drift off with this little snippet of weird history in your mind, remember, the real Viking superpower wasn't brute strength or epic beards. It was community, the original group chat, only with more sheep and less Wi-Fi. Endurance, after all, is a team sport. And speaking of resilience, let's take a detour from the frozen north to the wilds of Kentucky, where a young Abraham Lincoln was about to begin his own journey. One that started in a one-room log cabin, where just making it through the night was a victory in itself. Settle in, night owls. Let's drift back to the edge of the Kentucky wilderness, long before central heating, flush toilets, or anything that could be called comfortable. Picture that same one-room log cabin, crowded and drafty, perched on land so wild it seemed the trees might crawl through the walls at night. That's where Abraham Lincoln was born, on February 12, 1809, a date that probably didn't feel historic to anyone present, least of all the Lincolns themselves, who were just trying to survive another winter without freezing or starving. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a man of calloused hands and few words. He made a living the way most did out there, farming thin, stubborn soil and patching together shoes, tools, and furniture as needed. He could build you a barn, but he couldn't read the directions. Nancy Hanks Lincoln, Abraham's mother, was gentle and patient, and unlike most neighbors, she could read and write. On the frontier, that was a little like owning a spaceship. Impressive, but not always practical when there's mud up to your knees. Still, it was Nancy who planted the first seeds of curiosity in young Abe, who would grow up in a house with more smoke than books and more chores than childhood. Now, if you're picturing a cozy log cabin with gingham curtains and a roaring fire, let's adjust that mental image. The Lincolns' home was more like a wooden box with a leaky roof, no windows, dirt floor, and a door that groaned like it needed oiling every time you opened it. No bookshelves, unless you count the spot where Nancy stacked her battered Bible and the odd scrap of paper. It was the kind of place where your pillow might be a bundle of old rags, and your bedtime story was the sound of wolves howling in the forest. Every day, Abraham's world was shaped by candlelight and endless work. He learned to swing an axe before he learned to read, and his shirts were so patched you could map the family's poverty by tracing the seams. There wasn't much talk of school. Education was what you managed to scrape together, between hauling water and chopping wood. By Lincoln's own account, he had less than a full year of formal schooling. So, if you've ever worried you stepped through too much class, take heart. Lincoln mostly had to teach himself, squinting at borrowed books by the flickering light, dodging both boredom and splinters. When Abraham was just 9, his mother Nancy fell ill, likely from milk sickness, a charming frontier disease you get when cows eat toxic plants, and the toxins end up in the milk. She died quickly, leaving the family adrift. If you've ever lost someone important, you know the kind of hole that leaves behind. For Abraham, her death was a wound that never really healed. After Nancy's burial, done by hand in the woods behind their home, Abe carved a simple wooden marker. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest and handmade, just like everything else in his world. That winter was cold, bleak, and lonely. But not for long. Thomas Lincoln, practical as ever, remarried within a year. Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow from Kentucky, arrived with her own children, a wagon load of belongings, and, miracle of miracles, books. Unlike the fairy tale stepmothers who show up to ruin everything, Sarah brought warmth and order. She saw something in Abraham, a hungry mind behind the awkwardness and silence. She encouraged his reading, even when chores piled up and others rolled their eyes. Between feeding livestock and splitting logs, Abe devoured whatever he could get his hands on. Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. Sometimes the same paragraph over and over, until it stuck in his head like a tune you can't shake. If he couldn't get a book, Lincoln would write his own thoughts on wooden shingles, using a piece of charcoal. Imagine trying to do your homework, using the side of a burnt stick and a roof tile. This was boring history in action, survival, ingenuity, and a lot of squinting. The boy was tall, skinny, and always barefoot. His face was too serious for his age, and his foes were stitched together from whatever his stepmother could scrounge. But inside, something was smoldering. The world hadn't given him much, but it couldn't put out that restless curiosity. By his teenage years, the Lincolns had moved again, this time to the damp, mosquito-infested forests of Indiana. If you think Wi-Fi dead zones are rough, try living in a place where the only network is the one you make with your own two hands. Every day was a battle, clearing trees, plowing rocky soil, shivering through winters with only a smoky hearth and a thin blanket. Abraham's body grew strong, shaped by axe handles and icy wind, but his mind drifted elsewhere. Neighbors started to notice. He was unusually tall, even awkward, but it was the way he'd read while walking, or quote Shakespeare while fixing fences, that made him stand out. He developed a dry, almost sly sense of humor. It was the coping mechanism of a boy who didn't quite fit in, too serious for jokes about raccoons, too brainy for card games, and a little too honest for his own good. Lincoln was shy and talkative at the same time, a paradox in muddy boots. But when he spoke, people listened. His words were clear and sometimes funny, but always seemed to go straight to the heart of things. Even then, he hated cruelty and injustice. He hated slavery, and he couldn't stand when ignorance was used as an excuse for either one. His moral compass, as folks would later say, pointed due north, even when he was lost in the woods. With no school to speak of, Lincoln started to teach himself the law. The idea that you could win arguments with words instead of fists fascinated him. He began to read whatever law books he could borrow, sometimes copying entire sections onto scraps of paper. At night, while others gambled or swapped tall tales, Abe would be hunched over a borrowed book, reading Blackstone's commentaries by the weak glow of a tallow candle. It wasn't glamorous, but it was progress, and he knew it. By his early 20s, Lincoln decided it was time to leave home for good. He took a job as a flatboatman, floating goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. The trip was long, dirty, and dangerous. Think of it as the original gap year, but with more mosquitoes and less Instagram. Down in New Orleans, he saw the slave markets firsthand. The sight of people being bought and sold like cattle shook him deeply, burning itself into his memory. The experience didn't make him loud or radical, but it left a mark that would never fade. Back in Illinois, Lincoln moved to a small frontier village called New Salem, where he immediately began the slow, awkward process of reinventing himself. He studied grammar, joined a local debating society, and taught himself how to speak so people would listen. He had no diploma, no fancy connections, and certainly no money. All he had was a belief that knowledge was worth chasing, even if you had to chase it through mud and ridicule. Soon, Lincoln started reading law in earnest. He'd borrow books from local attorneys, copy passages by hand, and argue imaginary cases in his head. By sheer persistence, he passed the Illinois bar exam. No law school, no professors, just a lot of stubbornness and candle wax. Once admitted, Lincoln began riding the 8th Judicial Circuit, a sprawling network of rural courts spread out across central Illinois. He traveled the circuit on horseback, carrying his only suit and a few law books in his saddlebags. The roads were a mess, mud in spring, dust in summer, frozen ruts in winter, and the accommodations were primitive. He slept in taverns, on floors, sometimes under the stars, and probably never far from the unmistakable aroma of livestock. It wasn't glamour, but it was honest work, and Lincoln thrived on the unpredictability. What made him stand out as a lawyer wasn't just his sharp mind, but his compassion. He had a knack for connecting with jurors, speaking plainly, and weaving vivid stories that even the sleepiest farmer could follow. Lincoln didn't put on airs or try to impress with legal jargon. He treated every client with respect, no matter how poor or ragged. One farmer reportedly said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us." And that was the secret of his appeal. But don't let the soft-spoken image fool you. In the courtroom, Lincoln could be relentless when he believed in a case. His speeches started slow, sometimes almost awkward, but built up layer after layer, like a mason building a wall. until the opposition simply ran out of arguments. His cross-examinations were legendary. He'd lull witnesses into a sense of comfort, then ask one simple question that unraveled their entire story. He wasn't flashy, but he was effective. Lincoln's reputation for honesty, Honest Abe, wasn't a marketing gimmick. He lived it. If he thought a case was unjust, he'd return the client's money and walk away. If a client lied to him, he'd refuse to represent them. Other lawyers might cut corners or bend the rules, but Lincoln believed that integrity was worth more than a quick win. Over time, his name became a byword for trustworthiness on the prairie, and people came from miles around to hire him, not because he was the fanciest lawyer, but because he was the fairest. Behind the scenes, though, Lincoln's mind was wandering toward politics. The law had taught him how people worked, but he wanted to change the rules they lived by. As debates over slavery grew louder, Lincoln's quiet conscience started to wake up. He wasn't a bomb thrower, but he wasn't content to watch from the sidelines either. His first attempt at politics was, to put it kindly, a flop. At just 23, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. But Lincoln wasn't the sort to give up after one try. Losing didn't make him bitter. It made him curious. He listened more, traveled more, and learned to meet people where they were. 2 years later, he ran again, and this time, he won. In Springfield, the new capital, Lincoln became known for his dry wit, steady voice, and moral backbone. He wasn't a shouter or a schemer. He let his words do the work, and people remembered them. Lincoln joined the Whig Party, a group that believed in building things, roads, schools, railways, and in limiting executive power. He wasn't flashy. He often joked about being too awkward and too ugly for politics, and he spent as much time reading as he did schmoozing. But he was honest, and when he stood up in the legislature to speak, even his rivals leaned in. He cared more about understanding how society worked than about collecting easy victories or catchy slogans. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built alliances with farmers, shopkeepers, and fellow lawyers. He was rarely the loudest, but often the most trusted. His stance on slavery grew sharper with each passing year. He wasn't yet calling for abolition, but he was dead set against letting slavery spread into new territories. He called it unjust, immoral, and a stain on the nation's conscience. He wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, even when it cost him politically. In 1846, Lincoln made the leap to national politics, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stand against the Mexican-American War, arguing that it was unconstitutional and unnecessary. His district didn't like it, and it probably cost him his seat. Lincoln served only a single term, then went home to Springfield, where he returned to law, married the sharp and well-educated Mary Todd, herself from a slaveholding family, and tried, briefly, to settle into a quieter life. But the country was changing, and fast. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the relentless spread of slavery were tearing the nation apart. Lincoln had tried to step back from politics, but politics had other plans. The debates were growing louder, and the Union itself was starting to crack. The man who once joked about his lack of ambition was about to find himself swept into the storm, not as a candidate, but as the conscience of a country on the brink. And so, as the candle burns lower and the night deepens, we leave Lincoln on the edge of history, shaped by hardship, driven by honesty, and about to step onto a national stage. In our next late-night chapter, we'll watch as the simmering issue of slavery boils over, and Lincoln finds himself at the very center of a divided nation. Let's settle in for this next stretch of our late-night journey through weird history. A tale that's as much about sleepless nights as it is about the man himself. Picture it, the 1850s in America. If you thought the air in a Viking longhouse was tense, Imagine a country where the conversation about slavery wasn't just simmering quietly on the back burner. It was boiling over, splattering everywhere, and burning anyone who got close. The Kansas, Nebraska Act of 1854 was like someone flinging open the kitchen door and tossing in a whole extra log. Suddenly, brand new territories could decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. The result: bleeding Kansas. And yes, that's as cheerful as it sounds. A stretch of prairie transformed into a battleground, neighbors turning on neighbors, and the rest of the country watching, horrified, as the land of the free seemed to tear itself apart. Now, if you're lying in bed trying to fall asleep fast, you might wonder what any of this has to do with Abraham Lincoln, the man who, up until this point, had mostly wandered in and out of politics, like a guest who can't decide whether to stay for dessert or just head home. But for Lincoln, bleeding Kansas was the last straw. He couldn't keep quiet anymore. He stepped back onto the political stage, not with the dramatic flair of a Roman emperor, but with a quiet, stubborn conviction. He joined the new Republican Party, which was kind of like a historical greatest hits album, patched together from former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists who all agreed on one thing: slavery shouldn't expand. Here's the thing though. Lincoln wasn't the kind of abolitionist who stood on the street corner holding up radical signs. He didn't call for immediate, sweeping emancipation. Instead, he argued that slavery was wrong, plain and simple, and letting it spread would be both dangerous and unjust. In 1858, all this came to a head during his Senate campaign against the formidable Stephen Douglas. The two men agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, and what followed wasn't just a political contest, it was history in the making. If you've ever wanted a bedtime story about people yelling at each other politely, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are your jam. Douglas stood for popular sovereignty. Let the states decide, he said. Lincoln, on the other hand, channeled his inner prophet and declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He argued that the country couldn't survive half slave and half free. It was only a matter of time before it would split apart at the seams, like an old wool blanket in a drafty cabin. And while Lincoln didn't win the Senate seat, yes, I know, anticlimactic, he did win something more valuable: the nation's attention. Suddenly, newspapers everywhere were quoting the tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois, with the haunted eyes and the knack for saying what nobody wanted to hear. Privately, Lincoln was wrestling with the enormity of the problem. He once wrote, "If slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is wrong." But he also realized that moving too quickly might fracture the fragile union. Still, the tide was turning, and Lincoln was rising with it. Not as a man with easy answers, but as a voice of moral clarity in a time when most people would have preferred a nice, easy distraction, like a new flavor of hardtack. By 1860, America was perched on the knife edge of disaster. The question of slavery had erupted into a political firestorm. Southern states threatened to leave the Union if things didn't go their way, and the Republican Party was desperate for a leader who could hold the North together without triggering all-out war. Lincoln, as unlikely as it seemed, was that leader. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he wasn't the favorite. Most people expected the nomination to go to Senator William Seward, a polished, well-spoken political heavyweight. But Lincoln had a trump card: his reputation for honesty, his moderate approach, and the momentum from those debates with Douglas. His team worked behind the scenes, framing him as the self-made man, the honest rail splitter, who chopped wood and read books by candlelight without ever complaining about the lack of central heating. By the third ballot, Lincoln had clinched the nomination, and the political world did a collective double-take. The general election was messy and bitter, with the Democratic Party splitting in two like a pair of ill-fitting socks, one half for the North, one for the South. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on those Southern ballots, but in the North and the West, he was the clear favorite. When the dust settled on November 6, 1860, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He only got 40% of the popular vote, but won a decisive majority in the Electoral College, which, as always, left everyone scratching their heads and muttering about math. You'd think he might have celebrated, but the mood was about as festive as a rain-soaked sleep story. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede. 6 more states quickly followed, and Lincoln watched the Union unravel faster than a hand-knitted scarf in a house full of cats. As he prepared to leave Springfield for Washington, the threats started rolling in. Some people said he wouldn't survive the journey. Security was so tight, Lincoln had to sneak into the Capitol at night, disguised and unannounced, as if he were auditioning for a role in a particularly grim spy movie. So, there he was, taking the oath of office on March 4, 1861, staring out at a crowd that was angry, divided, and armed to the teeth. You might picture him shaking a fist or making grand threats, but instead, Lincoln reached for peace. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. He may as well have been whispering bedtime stories to a room full of insomniacs, hoping a little soothing language might chase away the nightmares. But the winds of war had already kicked down the door. Barely a month after Lincoln took office, shots rang out at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun, and America plunged headlong into its bloodiest conflict. The war tested not just armies and generals, but Lincoln himself. A man who, up to this point, had about as much military experience as your average late-night radio host. Sure, he'd served briefly as a captain in the Black Hawk War, but he'd never seen real combat. Now, he was commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. Lincoln spent long nights at the War Department, hunched over telegrams and maps, learning strategy on the fly. He read books on warfare, grilled his generals like an anxious parent at a parent-teacher conference, and obsessed over every move. He wasn't a warrior by nature, but he became one by necessity, sort of like a sleep-deprived parent who somehow learns to function on 2 hours of rest and cold coffee. The early years of Lincoln's presidency were marked by frustration. General after general let him down. George McClellan, in particular, had the loyalty of the troops, but the caution of someone afraid to leave the house without an umbrella. Lincoln, exasperated by the endless delays, famously quipped, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." Dry wit, even in wartime. But Lincoln's true genius wasn't just in learning the art of war. It was in his vision. He understood that the Civil War wasn't just about states' rights or secession. It was about the very soul of the nation. Could a country founded on liberty survive while half its people were enslaved? At first, Lincoln tiptoed around the issue of abolition, worried that moving too quickly would send the border states running to the Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, he began to see that the moral and military problems were one and the same. Slavery, he realized, was the engine that kept the Confederate war machine running. Unless it was destroyed, the rebellion would never end. On January the 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in Confederate-held territories were free. It didn't free everyone overnight. History rarely moves that fast, especially when it comes to boring history for sleep. But it changed the game. The war was no longer just about saving the Union. It was about fighting for human freedom. The proclamation also slammed the door on any hope the Confederacy had of gaining support from Britain or France, and it gave black men the legal and moral grounds to join the Union Army. Thousands did, fighting for a country that had spent centuries denying them citizenship. In those years, Lincoln transformed from the log cabin lawyer into a wartime president, wielding not just authority, but a kind of quiet, moral thunder. The war dragged into its 4th year, and Lincoln bore its weight alone at the top. He grew thinner, grayer, and visibly older with every passing day. Fresh casualty lists arrived with the morning sun, and towns all over the country became graveyards. Letters from grieving mothers and widows piled up on his desk. He never fought on a battlefield, but the war was etched into the lines on his face. His cabinet was a collection of former rivals, men who had run against him and didn't always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a maestro, guiding a particularly grumpy orchestra. He didn't rule by fear or force, but with patience, humor, and the occasional story. Even his harshest critics started to admit that there was steel beneath the smile. Then came Gettysburg. In July 1863, the tiny Pennsylvania town became the site of the war's turning point. Over 3 days of unimaginable horror, more than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. A few months later, Lincoln traveled to dedicate the new cemetery. He was only supposed to give a brief remark, a few words of reflection. But in just 272 words, he managed to reshape the meaning of the war. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was restrained, reverent, and unforgettable. Lincoln made it clear, this war was about more than just unity. It was about redemption, remaking the country into what it had always claimed to be. As the 1864 presidential election approached, Lincoln faced deep opposition. The war was still raging, and many people, including folks in his own party, wanted to replace him. Most believed he'd lose to Democrat George McClellan, the very general he'd once fired for being too cautious. But late that year, a string of Union victories, especially Sherman's capture of Atlanta, shifted public opinion. Lincoln was re-elected with a decisive margin. He didn't gloat. "It is not in my nature to triumph over anyone," he said, sounding more like a weary parent than a conquering hero. The war was almost over, but Lincoln knew that peace would be an even tougher battle. You can rebuild a country with muskets and legislation, but healing its soul takes something deeper: mercy, vision, and an endless well of patience. By early 1865, the Confederacy was falling apart. Cities surrendered one after another. Richmond, the Confederate capital, went up in flames. General Robert E. Lee's army was out of food, out of men, and out of time. And yet, Lincoln took no joy in the suffering of his enemies. For him, victory was never about punishment. It was about restoration. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, not as a conqueror, but as a moral philosopher. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. These weren't the words of a politician looking to crush his enemies. They were the words of a father trying to save his broken family. Even now, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of his voice. A bedtime story for a restless nation. On April 9, 1865, it finally ended. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was preserved. Slavery, through the ratification of the 13th Amendment, was abolished. For the first time in centuries, the country could take a trembling step toward the ideals it had written down in 1776, but never fully lived up to. But, as in all the best sleep stories, tragedy waited just around the corner. 5 days after the surrender, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. In the middle of the performance, an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15, 1865. The country collapsed into mourning. Black Americans, many newly freed, wept openly in the streets. Even former enemies in the South acknowledged that the nation had lost its best hope for healing and reconciliation. Lincoln had never seen politics as war. or allowed hatred to take root in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see Reconstruction or to heal the wounds his presidency had laid bare. But his death transformed him from a leader into something larger, a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful price of moral progress. From a dirt floor cabin in Kentucky to the highest office in the land, Lincoln rose without wealth, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led America through its darkest hour, not with blinding brilliance, but with a stubborn, steady light. That light, dimmed by an assassin's bullet, still glows in the long, strange saga of American history. And as we drift further into the night, you might be wondering what daily life was like for ordinary people living with the consequences of these great upheavals, how they coped with uncertainty, and, more practically, how they managed the more fragrant challenges of communal living. That brings us to our next boring history for sleep segment, where we'll travel even further back in time, to the very origins of sanitation. Because when we imagine the ancient world, we usually think of mighty empires, glittering temples, and epic battles. But what about the humble beginnings of the toilet? Stay tuned. Even the past has to get a little dirty sometimes. Tonight, as you let your mind wander through the dim corridors of boring history, I invite you to imagine not the kings or the conquerors, but something a little closer to home, the ancient world's ongoing, unglamorous fight with human waste. Yes, in the grand tapestry of history, between stories of pyramids and palaces, there's always someone, somewhere, quietly asking, where does it all go when you're done with it? It's a question that every civilization has had to answer, even if it's not the kind that gets a marble statue. Sanitation, that unsung hero of survival, is the real backbone of any functioning society. And if you're searching for sleep stories that are just weird enough to lull you into a gentle snooze, few things are as soothing as the thought of ancient people, elbow to elbow, sharing a communal latrine and a long, awkward silence. Let's pull back the curtain on the Indus Valley. This is not a place where you'd expect urban planning worthy of a modern city, but around 600 years before the Common Era, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, today nestled in modern Pakistan, were quietly rewriting the book on daily life. Forget the image of endless sand and forgotten ruins. Instead, picture an ancient city laid out in a tidy grid, every street lined with bricks and measured to match its neighbors, as if some Bronze Age city council had a real thing for rulers and right angles. But the real marvel wasn't above ground. It was below your sandals, right beneath the dust, a network of covered drains, brick-lined and shockingly sophisticated. While much of the ancient world was still dealing with the age-old question of where to dig the next hole, the folks of the Indus Valley had already moved on to bigger ideas, like how to keep waste moving away from living spaces and how to keep rainwater out of the mess. Every house, no matter how humble, usually came with its own dedicated washing space. Now, don't expect a bubble bath and mood lighting. Think more along the lines of a squat toilet or a simple bathing platform. From there, waste would travel down a vertical chute, out the wall, and into a covered drain running alongside the street. If you were a little wealthier, you might even have a jar of water to flush. The system, gravity doing the heavy lifting. These drains weren't just basic ditches. They had inspection holes for maintenance, careful gradients to keep things flowing, and even brick baffles to catch the solids, so you didn't end up with an ancient version of a city-wide clog. It's almost enough to make you appreciate the next time your modern plumbing decides to take a vacation. Perhaps the most remarkable part was how these cities separated rainwater from waste. Storm drains were their own thing, a detail that many later societies would miss entirely, much to their fragrant regret. Public wells were scattered across the city, suggesting that clean water was a communal right, not a luxury. It's worth pausing here, just for a moment, to reflect on the priorities of the Indus Valley people. They didn't spend their time building giant temples or towering palaces. In fact, there's barely a trace of either. Instead, their most enduring legacy is hidden in the silent, brick-lined arteries beneath their feet. Their focus was on practical, widespread comfort, on making sure everyone, rich or poor, had a shot at a clean and healthy home. It's a kind of democratic genius that wouldn't be out of place in the weird history section of your favorite sleep video. Sadly, mysteries remain. We still can't read their writing, and the reasons behind the eventual decline of these cities are lost to time. But what lingers is a quiet testament to a people who cared enough about daily life to engineer a solution to one of humanity's oldest problems. In the world of boring history for sleep, these silent drains have a lot to say. Now, let's drift a little west, down the Nile, where the ancient Egyptians were dealing with their own messes, sometimes literally. If the Indus Valley was all about practical public health, Egypt was about ritual, status, and an obsession with cleanliness that bordered on the spiritual. In Egypt, keeping clean was almost like preparing for an audience with the gods. Bathing was a daily ritual, especially if your bank account was as full as your granary. Picture a limestone basin in a sunlit room, a servant pouring cool water over your shoulders, and a cloud of perfumed oil in the air. Every morning, the well-to-do slathered themselves with natron, a naturally occurring salt, and finished it all off with a healthy dose of hair removal. It's a little like a spa day, if your spa day included mandatory head shaving and a strict no-body hair policy. Toilets, though, were much more down to earth. The average Egyptian might have settled for a simple sand-lined pit, or, if they were lucky, a seat carved from limestone or fashioned from wood, perched carefully above a ceramic pot. If you were wealthy, you might have a more private setup, tucked discreetly behind a screen or in a quiet corner of the house. But sooner or later, someone had to carry the pot out and empty it far from the house, usually into the waiting desert or the nearest field. In big cities like Thebes or Memphis, public sanitation was almost non-existent. The streets ran with the runoff of daily life, and while some waste went to fertilize crops, much of it simply lingered until the next flood or sandstorm swept it away. Still, the emphasis remained firmly on personal hygiene, especially for priests. These men bathed multiple times a day, shaved head to toe, and followed strict routines to avoid any impurity. Ritual enemas weren't just about health. They were part of spiritual prep, as if you couldn't possibly approach the divine with yesterday's sins, or anything else, still hanging around. What's truly fascinating is that even in death, the Egyptians planned for toilet time. Archaeologists have found toilet stools tucked into tombs alongside the usual gold and treasures, as if the afterlife might have a waiting line for the nearest facilities. If you ever find yourself haunted in your own bathroom, now you know where that comes from. Of course, the Egyptians were also early pioneers of pest control. Spells, amulets, and ointments were as much about keeping flies and other disease carriers at bay as about pleasing the gods. In a way, their obsession with purity wove together the physical and the mystical, making daily life a kind of never-ending ritual. So, while Egypt never built sprawling underground sewers, its people carved out a place in history by making cleanliness a cultural pillar. Their ideas about hygiene shaped their medicine, their faith, and even their sleep. After all, it's hard to drift off if you're worried about evil spirits or biting flies. Now, if you think Bronze Age Europe was a place of pit toilets and questionable odors, you'd be mostly right, unless you happened to be Minoan. On the island of Crete, in the labyrinthine city of Knossos, the Minoans were doing something that still makes modern plumbers a little jealous. They were flushing. Yes, you heard that correctly. Over 3,500 years ago, the Minoans had cracked the code on indoor plumbing. Knossos wasn't just a place of myth and minotaurs. It was a city of multi-story buildings, running water, and bathrooms that actually worked. The Minoans had figured out gravity and water pressure connecting their palaces with a network of terracotta pipes that carried rainwater and spring water into baths, fountains, and, most impressively, toilets. In the Queen's Mega Run, the fancy name for the palace's best room, archaeologists uncovered what might be the world's oldest flush toilet. It's not exactly a porcelain throne, but a wooden seat set over a stone basin, connected to a pipe that whisked waste away with a bucket of water. You had to do the flushing yourself, but the result was the same, a clean break from the past. Bathing was serious business for the Minoans. They built large, stylish ceramic bathtubs that wouldn't look out of place in a modern bathroom. Water was piped down from rooftop tanks, or even aqueducts, then drained out through underground channels. Some scholars argue that they even used U-shaped water traps to keep the bad smells at bay, a kind of ancient solution to a modern problem. If that's true, your own bathroom owes a little nod of gratitude to the Minoans. What really sets the Minoans apart is how they made private sanitation a status symbol. Unlike the communal latrines that would later become the norm in the Roman world, Minoan toilets were usually tucked away inside private homes. If you had your own bathroom, you'd made it. For most of Europe, indoor plumbing was still a distant dream, one that wouldn't become reality for over 1,000 years. But the Minoans weren't just practical, they had style. Their bathrooms were decorated with vibrant frescoes and smooth plasterwork. Sanitation was as much about beauty as about function. Maybe you can picture a Minoan noble soaking in a decorated tub, the air heavy with incense, while outside the sea breeze rattled the olive trees. It's a far cry from the communal pit toilets of their neighbors, and it's proof that even in the Bronze Age, some people were living the dream, at least when it came to bathroom breaks. Unfortunately, Minoan civilization didn't last forever. Around 1450, before the Common Era, everything changed, maybe because of volcanoes, tsunamis, or invading neighbors. Either way, their advanced plumbing vanished with them, and Europe was left to rediscover the joys of indoor toilets centuries later. Still, if you listen carefully to the ruins of Knossos, you might just hear the echoes of running water, reminding us that the pursuit of comfort and cleanliness isn't just modern. It's been a bedtime story for as long as people have needed a good night's sleep. So, the next time you lie awake, drifting through boring history for sleep, remember, civilizations rise and fall, but the need to keep things clean never goes out of style. From the silent brick drains of the Indus Valley, to the ritual baths of Egypt, to the stylish flush toilets of Minoan Crete, the story of sanitation is really the story of ordinary people doing their best to make life a little less messy. If nothing else, it's a reminder that, in the end, we're all just trying to get comfortable and maybe fall asleep fast without any unexpected surprises from below. And speaking of bold solutions to messy problems, our next stop is a civilization that took public sanitation and ran with it all the way to the Forum. No civilization made a bigger, bolder statement about ancient sanitation than the Romans. Let's see just how far you can take the idea of communal toilets, public baths, and a city that runs on water. Settle in, friends. Tonight, we're taking a nighttime stroll through the world's oldest bathrooms. Yes, really. Because when you're lying awake, nothing says, fall asleep fast. Quite like a guided tour of ancient toilets. This is boring history at its most intimate, and I'm your drowsy late-night host, here to make you grateful for your modern flush with stories for sleep about sanitation, survival, and some truly questionable communal habits. Let's start in the heart of Rome, where nothing was ever done halfway. Not even the business of, well, doing your business. The Romans were obsessed with infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, stadiums, and, crucially, sanitation. At the height of their empire, if you wandered through a bustling Roman city, imagine Pompeii's mosaic streets or the shadowy alleys of Londinium. You'd stumble upon a public latrine almost as easily as a bakery. And when I say public, I mean it in the most literal sense. Picture this. You step into a stone-walled room, humming with conversation, laughter, maybe even a heated debate about chariot racing. Instead of privacy, you're greeted by a long stone bench, cool to the touch, lined with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no partitions, just a row of strangers, elbow to elbow, handling nature's call together like it's a community potluck. Beneath the bench, water flows in a constant stream, whisking waste away with the efficiency you'd expect from people who also built the Colosseum. Now, here's where Roman ingenuity takes a turn for the weird history books. Instead of toilet paper, they used tesseria, sponges attached to sticks, dunked in water and vinegar after each use, then returned to a communal bucket for the next person. If you're curling your toes in your sheets right now, good. That's the proper reaction. Was it hygienic? Not so much. Was it effective? Absolutely, at least by first century standards. But the real surprise is what happened above the bench. Roman latrines weren't just functional, they were lively social spaces. People gossiped, closed business deals, maybe even plotted a little political intrigue, all while perched on cold stone. Some latrines were decorated with colorful mosaics or cheeky inscriptions. Archaeologists have found plenty of graffiti in Pompeii's toilets, complaints about the stench, drawings mocking bad plumbing, and the ancient equivalent of, for a good time, scratch here. Truly, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Of course, Roman sanitation didn't stop at the latrine door. Their cities were woven together by cloaca, massive sewer systems like the legendary Cloaca Maxima in Rome. Originally built to drain marshes, this engineering marvel became the city's central waste artery. Rainwater, urine, and everything else you'd rather not think about flowed through tunnels beneath the city, fed by aqueducts that delivered fresh water from distant hills. You couldn't see the system, but you knew it was there, especially when it backed up. If you were wealthy, you might have a private toilet in your domus, tucked discreetly behind the kitchen, draining into a cesspit, or, if you were especially lucky, straight into the city's sewers. But most Romans, especially the poor packed into multi-story insulae, made do with chamber pots. And despite laws against it, these pots were often dumped out of windows, sometimes with a shouted warning, sometimes not. Imagine walking the Roman streets and glancing up, not for rain, but to dodge flying waste. It gives a whole new meaning to keep your head down. And then there was the infamous urine tax. Yes, you heard that right. Emperor Vespasian, master of the pee tax, decided that public urinals were such a civic necessity. They deserved their own revenue stream. The pee collected was sold to tanners and launderers, urine being a handy source of ammonia for cleaning. Vespasian's name is still attached to public urinals in France and Italy. If you ever find yourself in Paris, you can thank a Roman emperor every time nature calls. Roman toilets weren't just advanced, they were crowded, noisy, political, and oddly progressive. They may have been the first civilization to treat sanitation as a public good, a shared responsibility. And sure, you might have to share a sponge with your neighbor, but at least you could debate philosophy while you waited. Now, let's drift east, where the Greeks were busy perfecting the art of doing things quietly. For the ancient Greeks, bodily functions were not a group activity. They believed some matters should be kept private, preferably behind closed doors, or at the very least, far from the agora. Most Greek homes kept things simple, a clay pot or a stone seat over a cesspit, tucked away from the main living quarters. There were no flush handles, no clever plumbing. Emptying these pots wasn't a glamorous job. It usually fell to slaves, who would haul the contents to pits outside the city or dump them in remote locations. City streets sometimes featured open drains, but as Athens grew, so did the unmistakable aroma of neglect. Sanitation was a challenge, but not always a priority. especially compared to theatre, olive oil, or winning at the Olympics. But if the Greeks were modest about their waste, they were downright passionate about bathing. The gymnasium, where men exercised, wrestled, and discussed the finer points of democracy, almost always had an attached bathhouse. These weren't the marble palaces of Roman legend, but simpler affairs, circular tubs, chilly water basins, or shallow pools. You'd scrub off the day's dust, chat about philosophy, and maybe argue about whether Socrates was really as clever as he claimed. Water was precious, and the Greeks built aqueducts and terracotta pipe systems to supply cities like Athens. The Athenian agora even boasted one of the earliest known public latrines, a row of stone seats over a drainage channel. But such luxuries were rare, and the public toilet never became a Greek institution like it did in Rome. What the Greeks lacked in plumbing, they made up for in theory. Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, was one of the first to suggest that filth and dirty water could make you sick. He preached the virtues of fresh air, clean water, and dry housing, ideas that would eventually trickle down to Roman city planners. For the Greeks, personal cleanliness wasn't just about health, it was about moral purity. A clean body reflected a clean mind, and a clean mind was the key to a virtuous life. So while their toilets might have been primitive, their obsession with purity, both physical and philosophical, helped lay the groundwork for the way we think about public health today. They may not have built sewers to rival Rome, but they understood that cleanliness was a virtue worth striving for. Now, let's cross to ancient China, where cleanliness was less about engineering and more about harmony, both with oneself and the universe. Sanitation in China didn't mean aqueducts or marble benches. It meant ritual, order, and a surprising assortment of toilet tools. Most Chinese homes, from humble huts to imperial palaces, relied on chamber pots. These portable containers ranged from simple clay jars to ornate bronze vessels, sometimes engraved with dragons or cloud motifs. After use, the pots were emptied into larger cesspits or taken outside the city walls. In the countryside, families collated night soil, yes, human waste, and spread it on fields as fertilizer, a practice that might make a modern gardener blanch, but kept the crops growing and the fields green. Big cities like Chang'an or Luoyang had public toilets too. These communal facilities were basic, pits or troughs with wooden planks to squat or sit on. Some even had privacy screens, a considerate touch you wouldn't find in Roman latrines. The waste here was collected and used for agriculture, which, while efficient, came with its own set of risks. It's one thing to fertilize your carrots, another to wonder if you're getting more than you bargained for. And here's a sleep story twist. China may have been the birthplace of toilet paper. As early as the 2nd century before our era, people were using soft papers, often scraps of old writings, to clean themselves. By the 6th century, scholars were writing about paper made just for the purpose. The wealthy used silk cloth or polished bamboo spatulas, washed and reused, because even in the ancient world, luxury meant never having to shea or sponge. Hygiene in China wasn't just about staying clean, it was about maintaining balance. Confucian ideals stressed order and respect, and Taoist beliefs linked purity to cosmic harmony. Excrement was considered a pollutant, something to be dealt with swiftly and never mentioned in polite conversation. In the imperial court, waste disposal was handled by eunuchs, who managed the process with a level of secrecy that would impress any modern spy agency. Despite the absence of underground sewers, Chinese cities stayed relatively tidy, thanks to strict taboos, diligent labor, and a well-organized system of waste collection. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. An understated, humble approach to sanitation, rooted in centuries of tradition. Let's pivot north, where the Vikings, yes, those burly, axe-wielding seafarers, were quietly out cleaning much of medieval Europe. You might not picture Vikings as models of hygiene, But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find a culture that took cleanliness quite seriously, especially compared to their continental neighbors. In Viking settlements like Jorvik, now modern York, or Hedeby, archaeologists have dug up latrine pits lined with timber or stone. Practical solutions to the everyday challenge of living with a dozen people and no central plumbing. These pits were usually set a short walk from the longhouse, and sometimes covered by a wooden shed to keep out the wind and the worst of the winter cold. Waste wasn't just dumped and forgotten. Pits were periodically emptied out, sometimes reused, sometimes simply abandoned for a fresh hole. Some Norse communities even practiced early composting, letting waste break down and enrich the soil for future crops. Inside the home, chamber pots and buckets were the tools of choice, especially during those dark, frozen winters when even the bravest Viking hesitated to step outside in nothing but his ancient thermal leggings. These were emptied into the latrine pits or onto dung heaps at the edge of the settlement. Not glamorous, but practical, and a lot more sanitary than tossing it out the window, as was all too common in some later European cities. But Viking hygiene didn't stop at the toilet. These folks bathed regularly, usually once a week, on washing day, which eventually gave us the word Saturday. Combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners, carved from bone or antler, turn up in Viking graves as often as swords. Grooming was a matter of pride and even romance. Nobody wanted to show up at the thing looking like a wild animal. For the Vikings, cleanliness was just another part of survival, a way to keep the lice at bay and the marriage prospects bright. Their approach to sanitation was pure pragmatism. Dig a pit, wash what you can, keep the filth outside and away from your food. No heroic engineering feats, no marble mosaics, just a kind of blunt efficiency that matched their landscape. In the land of ice and iron, you did your business. Then you got back to your business. Across centuries and continents, every society faced the same smelly challenge: how to separate people from their waste. The Romans and Minoans built aqueducts and sewers, investing in infrastructure that sometimes rivaled anything seen until the 19th century. The Greeks and Chinese rooted their approach in personal discipline, linking hygiene to ethics and the cosmic order. The Vikings, well, they just dug a hole and got on with life. Despite their differences, all these cultures were aiming for the same thing: survival, health, and a little bit of dignity. The reasons varied, sometimes to prevent disease, sometimes to honor the gods, sometimes just to keep the streets from turning into open sewers. But the outcome shaped the growth of cities, the writing of laws, and even the way people thought about their bodies. The irony, of course, is that much of this ancient wisdom vanished after Rome fell. The sewers clogged, the bathhouses closed, and Europe's cities became breeding grounds for disease. It took centuries and more than a few plagues before urban planners revisited ideas the ancients had already figured out. And yet, traces of those old solutions linger. Our word latrine comes from Latin. The flush toilet owes something to the gravity-fed marbles of Minoan Crete. Even paper in the bathroom echoes an invention from Chinese scholars 1,000 years ago. What seems modern is often just rediscovered. Sanitation doesn't get the glory. It's not the stuff of epic poems or marble statues. But it's the hidden backbone of civilization. Without it, cities crumble, populations dwindle, and even the mightiest empires can fall. So next time you step into a restroom, enjoying your privacy, your plumbing, maybe even your scented soap, remember you're living the dream those ancient Romans, Greeks, and Vikings could only imagine. And now, as you drift further into sleep, let's wander from the bathhouse to the map room. Because before anyone could chart a sewer system, they had to chart the world. Up next, the origins of mapping, from prehistory to the earliest civilizations. Before satellites, compasses, or even writing, humans had an instinct to map. And that, dear listeners, is where our next sleepy chapter begins. Picture this, friends. Long before Google Maps, before anyone scribbled directions on a napkin, and even before paper existed, people were still trying to figure out where they stood in the universe. It's a universal instinct. Maybe you've felt it, lost in a parking garage at night, using the faint glow of your phone as a beacon. Now imagine you're in an endless forest, where the world is mostly rivers, stones, and the occasional woolly mammoth. In those days, maps weren't just handy. They were vital, almost magical. They helped you find your way, yes, but also helped you understand your place in a world that was as mysterious as it was dangerous. The earliest humans, the ones who had never even dreamed of writing, still felt the urge to map, but their versions wouldn't fit in your glove compartment. Some of the first maps were scratched onto flat stones, carved into animal bones, or, my personal favorite, woven directly into stories passed down around smoky hearthfires. If you could travel back 14,000 years, you might stumble across a slab of rock with lines and animal shapes etched into it. At first glance, it might look like a child's doodle. But look closer and you'd see rivers, clusters of huts, maybe even hunting trails. Was it a map, the way we think of one today? Not exactly. But it was a start, a way of connecting movement, memory, and meaning. As communities grew and trade routes stretched out across mountains and deserts, maps shifted from memory aids to tools of survival and power. Traders needed to know the safest mountain passes. Kings wanted to know exactly where their lands ended and where someone else's began, especially if it meant taxes. Priests and astronomers, never ones to be outdone, began mapping the heavens, turning their gaze upwards to chart the stars and planets. If you could map the cosmos, you were touching the realm of the gods. And if you could draw a tidy city plan, you were bringing order to the wild chaos just beyond the city's edge. But let's not pretend people were always striving for accuracy. Ancient maps wouldn't win any awards for scale or proportion. In fact, they were often delightfully biased. The world's center, always wherever you called home. If you were Babylonian, Babylon was smack in the middle. If you lived in Jerusalem, that was the heart of everything. The farther from home, the stranger the landscape became. Sometimes the blank spaces on the map were filled with cartoonish monsters, or simply labeled with a warning, "Here be dragons." I suppose that's one way to tell your kids not to wander too far. And here's a twist. Not every culture thought maps had to be flat or even visual. If you were a Polynesian navigator, for example, you didn't bother with parchment or paper. Instead, you'd build a stick chart, an ingenious lattice of twigs and shells that recorded the patterns of ocean currents, swells, and the locations of distant islands. These weren't maps you could glance at and understand instantly. You had to feel them, memorize them, and pass them down through ritual and training. Imagine learning to navigate the Pacific Ocean by touch and memory alone, or while your boat rocks under the stars. Take that, GPS. What ties all these early maps together is the deeply human urge to make sense of space, time, and our own position in the grand mess of things. Whether you were carving lines into clay, painting on cave walls, or singing the landscape into being, you were mapping your connection to the land, to your gods, and to each other. Everyone had their own method, their own priorities, but the goal was always the same: find your place in a world that refuses to stand still. Let's amble over now to ancient Mesopotamia, where the Babylonians took mapping to a whole new level. Imagine the scene: the sun rising over mud brick ziggurats, the air thick with the smells of livestock and river mud, a perfume that's probably not going to make it into any modern sleep stories, but it was the scent of civilization. Here, in the cradle of civilization, maps weren't just useful, they became cosmic documents. Priests and scribes pressed wedge-shaped cuneiform symbols into wet clay tablets, capturing more than just the lay of the land. They were trying to impose logic on the chaos of existence. Take the Imago Mundi, for instance. This little clay tablet, about the size of a dessert plate, might not look like much, but it's one of the oldest known world maps, dating back to the 6th century before the Common Era. If you could hold it, gently please, because museum security would definitely not appreciate any accidents. You'd see Babylon itself right in the center, drawn as a neat rectangle. The Euphrates River winds through like a dividing line, and all around, labeled in tiny cuneiform script, are other cities, mountains, and mysterious regions. Beyond the familiar world, there's a bitter river representing the ocean, and then clusters of odd triangular shapes. The descriptions say things like, the place where the sun is not seen, or the land of utter darkness, not exactly tourist destinations. These edges weren't about accuracy. They were about warning you that, beyond the known, chaos reigned. Babylonian maps didn't just plot territory, they mapped the limits of human understanding. They were half guidebook, half cosmic warning label. And if you think that's dramatic, well, remember, this was a world where the line between gods, monsters, and neighbors was awfully thin. But the Babylonians weren't just gazing at the horizon. They were also looking up, mapping the stars with a precision that would make modern astronomers give a respectful nod. On clay tablets, they tracked the movements of planets, the cycles of the moon, and even predicted eclipses. These celestial charts weren't just academic. They were used to interpret omens, to decide when to plant crops, or to divine the fate of kings. In a sense, the map of the sky was a blueprint for surviving on Earth. And you thought checking your horoscope was intense. Meanwhile, for the everyday business of keeping society running, Babylonian officials got down to the nitty-gritty of land surveys. Picture a scribe, stylus in hand, squinting at a plot of farmland while trying to ignore the relentless sun and the suspiciously judgmental goats. These clay records, some dating back as far as 2300 before the Common Era, detailed boundaries, irrigation canals, and ownership. It wasn't about grand cosmic order anymore. It was about who owed whom and how much barley you could squeeze out of a dry field. Mapping here was an exercise in bureaucracy, a tool for tax collectors and priests who, let's be honest, probably weren't known for their generosity. What you see in Babylonian mapping, then, is a blend of the practical and the mystical. The world was charted with Babylon at its heart, surrounded by rivers, enemies, gods, and endless mysteries. Each map was more than a record of land. It was a statement about how the Babylonians saw themselves in relation to everything else. Now let's drift down the Nile, where the Egyptians were busy turning mapping into an annual ritual of survival. If Babylonian maps were about myth and cosmos, Egyptian maps were all about the land itself. Every year the Nile flooded, wiping out whatever boundary stones and markers had been set up the previous year. Imagine your property lines vanishing in a murky soup, and your neighbor, who always claims the best turnips, suddenly insisting half your garden is his. To restore some semblance of order, Egyptian surveyors, known as harpadanaptai, which is just as fun to say as it is to spell, would march out with ropes, rods, and measuring tools to redraw the grid. This wasn't a job for amateurs. Mapping became a state-controlled operation, managed by temple scribes and royal officials. Surviving papyri show that Egyptian maps were remarkably precise. One of the oldest surviving examples is the Turin Papyrus map, created around 1160 before the Common Era. This wasn't a pretty picture to hang in the palace. It was a working document, a mining map showing wadis, hills, and regions rich with gold. Streams, roads, and quarry sites are all marked out, complete with notes in hieratic script about distances and what kind of treasure you might unearth there. Not exactly a choose-your-own-adventure story, but for the officials in charge, it was pure gold. But the Egyptians, ever the overachievers, didn't stop with practical mapping. They infused their cartography with symbolism. Temples were built in careful alignment with celestial events. Cities were laid out according to sacred geometry, and even the pyramids were oriented with a kind of mathematical perfection that would make your high school geometry teacher weep with joy. Maps here weren't just about land. They were about harmony, about ma'at, the elusive balance between chaos and order. Every inch of territory had to fit into the cosmic plan. And when it came to the afterlife, the Egyptians mapped that too. Open up the Book of the Dead or the Amduat, and you'll find intricate scenes of the soul's journey through 12 hours of night, each one guarded by serpents, gods, and gates. These were not maps for navigation in the earthly sense, but they were a kind of spiritual guidebook, a bedtime story for eternity, if you like. The soul needed directions, after all, and no one wanted to get lost on the way to paradise. In the end, Egyptian cartography was as much about bureaucracy as it was about belief. Whether they were measuring a farmer's plot, planning a new city, or guiding the dead through the underworld, maps were tools of divine order, a way to stay in tune with the gods and with each other. So, as you settle in for tonight's episode of Boring History for Sleep, remember, the urge to map was never just about finding your way from point A to point B. It was about claiming a place in the world, in the cosmos, and even in the afterlife. And if you ever lose your car at the mall, just be glad you don't have to rely on a clay tablet or a stick chart. Now, as the night deepens and we drift from the land of floodplains and clay tablets, we turn our gaze to a new chapter. While the Greeks didn't invent maps, they completely changed how people thought about them. And that, my fellow insomniacs, is a story worth staying up for. All right, night owls, insomniacs, and anyone else drifting through the late hours with me, settle in. You're tuned to our ongoing, gently meandering broadcast, where boring history is the lullaby, and weird history is the recurring dream. Tonight, we're unfurling a new scroll for our sleep stories, tracing how ancient maps became more than just navigational tools. They embodied power, science, and the very shape of empires. So, fluff your pillow, let your eyelids droop, and let's wander through a chapter where cartography isn't just a tongue twister, but a tool that shapes civilization itself. Picture the world before GPS, before Google Earth, before even the humble street sign, when the closest thing to a navigation app was asking a traveler at the crossroads if you were heading toward Athens or just someone's goat pasture. Now, the Greeks didn't invent the map, but they did something arguably more radical. They made maps think. They turned the act of mapping from something you did simply out of necessity, like when you needed to figure out where the nearest clean latrine was, which, spoiler alert, was basically nowhere, into a grand intellectual puzzle. Let me introduce you to Anaximander, a philosopher from Miletus, back in the 6th century before the Common Era. Imagine him hunched over parchment, not drawing a treasure map, but sketching a vision of the world as a circular disk, with familiar land masses like Europe and Asia, spread around the central blue of the Mediterranean. The map itself is long lost, probably recycled as a proto-toilet roll in some ancient public bathhouse. But historical sources describe it as more than just a doodle. It was symbolic, yes, but it also marked a moment when Greeks started to break away from seeing geography as pure myth. They were trying, for the first time, to capture the real world on paper, to make space rational, not just legendary. After Anaximander came Hecataeus, who took these early sketches and, with the doggedness of someone determined to win history's most boring travel blogger award, expanded them through his journeys and his curiosity. He added notes about distant peoples, customs, and lands, the kind of details you might jot down if you were trying to justify your vacation as work research. But then, centuries later, along came Claudius Ptolemy. If you want a poster child for Greek cartography nerdiness, Ptolemy is your guy. His masterpiece, Geography, written in the 2nd century of the Common Era, reads a bit like a proto-Excel document, except instead of quarterly sales, you got over 8,000 place names with coordinates, detailed instructions for drawing maps, and a grid-based system of latitude and longitude. All that, and he didn't even have a calculator, let alone a smartphone. Ptolemy even developed projections to squish the curved Earth onto a flat surface, something that still confuses modern cartographers and geography teachers alike. Greek maps, though, were never just about getting from point A to point B. They were windows into the Greek worldview, a world where Greece was at the center, the oikoumene, or the inhabited world, ringed by oceans and lands filled with folks the Greeks called barbarians. The further you went from Greece, the more exaggerated and strange the geography became, a bit like your uncle's travel stories after his third glass of Retsina. It was part honest ignorance, part cultural chest thumping. And while we're passing around honorary degrees in weird history, let's not forget Eratosthenes. Working in Alexandria in the 3rd century before the Common Era, he set out to measure the Earth's circumference using nothing more than shadows, geometry, and a humble stick. Imagine the scene: the midday sun, a well, and a man squinting at the ground, doing trigonometry with nothing but his brain and a bit of string. Incredibly, he came within a few hundred miles of the actual answer. That's the kind of math flex that makes you wish you'd paid more attention in geometry class. For the Greeks, then, mapping became a kind of decoding the Earth's size, shape, and even its place in the universe. They turned maps from myth into science, and the world would never look quite the same again. But if the Greeks gave us the theory of cartography, the Romans gave us its muscle. The Roman Empire was a patchwork quilt of peoples, languages, and suspiciously similar tasting stews. But what really stitched it together was an obsession with roads, order, and control. You might say that where the Greeks mapped the heavens, the Romans mapped the highway rest stops. Roman maps weren't concerned with the sweep of the cosmos. They were about boots on the ground, or more accurately, sandals on the road. The most famous Roman map, the Tabula Peutingeriana, is less a map and more a spreadsheet with roads. Imagine a subway map where distance is sacrificed for clarity, land masses stretched, rivers squished, but every road, every station, every rest stop, clearly marked. It's not the world as it is, but the world as the Romans needed it to be, connected, navigable, and, above all, taxable. These maps were functional tools for military commanders, merchants, and messengers. They showed where to find the next way station, where to swap out your tired horse, and exactly how many Roman miles it would take to get to the next city. Forget about scenic routes. This was about efficiency, supply lines, and making sure the empire ran on time, even if you had to sleep in a smoky roadside inn with questionable bread and even more questionable company. Roman mapping didn't stop at roads. They also developed cadastral maps, detailed records of land ownership and boundaries. Some were so important, they were literally engraved in bronze and posted in public places for all to see. It was bureaucracy with a flourish. If you wanted to know who owned the field next to yours, you could check the local bronze tablet. Power, in Rome, came from knowing where every inch of land lay and who owed taxes on it. Control of land meant control of people, and the Romans understood that with a kind of ruthless, spreadsheet-loving clarity. Curiously, the Romans didn't really care about mapping the entire world, or the stars, or the far-off lands of myth. Their gaze was always fixed on what could be conquered, measured, and, ideally, added to the tax rolls. The map, for the Romans, wasn't a cosmic vision. It was a tool of empire, as practical as a legionnaire's sandals and about as glamorous. But by making the empire legible, Roman maps gave people a sense of belonging to something bigger than their local village or tribe. They created a map of the possible, not just the known. Now, while the Greeks were playing with geometry and the Romans were building the world's first logistics app, the Chinese were doing something arguably even more ambitious. In ancient China, maps weren't just practical tools or bureaucratic checklists. They were bridges between Earth, empire, and the cosmos itself. To map the land was to map cosmic order, to demonstrate the emperor's mandate under heaven. Some of the earliest Chinese maps we know about come from the 4th century before the Common Era, found tucked away in tombs, like the one at Mawangdui. These silk maps, delicate as a spider's web, show rivers winding, roads weaving, and military positions marked with a careful hand. They weren't meant for travelers, unless you count guiding the spirit of the deceased through the afterlife, or maybe just showing off to the ancestors how well you managed your estate. You know, priorities. By the Han Dynasty, which ran roughly from 2006 before the Common Era to 2020 in the Common Era, Chinese cartography had grown up. Officials now used maps to govern provinces, plan military campaigns, and, of course, figure out who owed what to whom. They even had surveying instruments, like the gnomon and sighting tubes, to measure land with a degree of accuracy that would have made a Roman bureaucrat nod in approval. Some hand maps even used coordinate grids, centuries before that idea traveled west. One of the true luminaries of Chinese mapping was Pei Xiu, who worked in the 3rd century of the Common Era. His principles for scientific map making, emphasizing scale, direction, and standardized measurement, became the gold standard across China and eventually spread to Korea. He set down the rules for how to turn messy reality into a map, earning him the title, the father of Chinese cartography. Not a bad legacy, especially when most people from that era are remembered for slightly more dubious accomplishments, like inventing new types of fermented cabbage. But in China, mapping extended far beyond land. Cosmological charts were essential. The night sky was mapped into constellations grouped by celestial palaces and mythic beasts, the azure dragon of the east, the white tiger of the west, and so on. These star charts weren't just pretty. They guided farming, imperial rituals, even the timing of census reports. The emperor's rule was seen as legitimate only if it aligned with the cosmic harmony mapped above. If the emperor's maps, and by extension his government, slipped out of sync with the stars, he risked losing the mandate of heaven. No pressure. Chinese maps, then, weren't merely bureaucratic checklists or travel aids. They were statements of philosophy, politics, and belief. Every map was a kind of bridge between chaos and order, between earth and sky, between the living and the ancestors. Whether painted on silk, cast in bronze, or carved in stone, a map in ancient China was as much about imposing clarity on the world as it was about finding your way from one smoky, communal living arrangement to the next. So, as you drift deeper into this sleep video, disguised as a boring history lesson, think about the maps beneath your pillow, the silent, invisible lines of power, science, and empire that shaped how people saw themselves and the world around them. Whether you're a Greek philosopher squinting at shadows, a Roman road surveyor dreaming of spreadsheets, or a Chinese official aligning his maps with the cosmos, the act of mapping has always been about much more than lines on parchment. It's about who gets to decide where you are, and maybe even who you are. Now, don't drift off just yet, because next up in our bedtime stories for insomniacs, we're sailing away from the vast empires of Eurasia to lands where maps weren't drawn with ink, but with sticks, shells, and memory. Far from the massive empires of Eurasia, the Polynesians developed one of the most unique and abstract forms of mapping the world. So fluff your pillow one more time, and let's set course for the open ocean. If you're just settling in under the covers, or maybe you've turned on this sleep video hoping to fall asleep fast while learning a little weird history, let's take a gentle detour from the usual hustle of kings, wars, and questionable medieval cuisine. Tonight, we're exploring something almost magical. Maps, not your modern, GPS-powered, recalculating route. Maps, but the kind dreamed up by people who had to survive by their wits, their senses, and a fair amount of trial and error. This bedtime story is all about how maps have always been more than just directions. They're mirrors of the leaf, sometimes practical, sometimes deeply strange, always revealing what mattered most to the people who made them. Picture this. You're somewhere in the vast Pacific, surrounded by endless water, no land in sight, and you have no compass, no written guide, not even a soggy tourist brochure. Yet, you're not lost. You're Polynesian, and you've inherited a knowledge system that makes Google Maps look like a toddler's crayon doodle. The Marshall Islands stick charts weren't drawn on paper, and there was no ink involved, just coconut fronds, bits of wood, and twine. Forget about accurate scale or neat borders. These maps were built from experience, memory, and a sense of the sea so sharp, it makes you wonder if they had sonar in their bones. Let's set the scene. A master navigator sits cross-legged, weaving thin strips of wood together, each curve and intersection representing the invisible highways of the ocean. The curves are not random. They're the shape of swirls, the way waves bend and bounce around islands. Tiny shells or knots mark the locations of islands, and the arrangement of sticks records the patterns of the ocean's surface, refractions, cross-currents, and the subtle clues that only a true wayfinder can read. To you or me, these stick charts might look like the aftermath of a particularly ambitious game of pick-up sticks. But for a Polynesian sailor, they were as precise as any modern map. There were different types, each with its own purpose. The Ribbolib covered entire archipelagos. Think of it as the Pacific's answer to a subway map, but with more risk of sharks. The Meadow focused on smaller regions or specific journeys. Then there were Matang, and these weren't for taking on the boat, but for training and teaching. They helped explain how waves behave when they hit land, how patterns shift near islands, and how to read the ocean's mood. Here's the twist. These charts weren't meant to be carried on the journey. They were studied, memorized, internalized, sort of like cramming for the most important exam of your life. Only the classroom is a canoe, and the penalty for failing is, well, floating off into the endless blue. A skilled navigator could cross hundreds of miles of open water, using only what they'd learned from the chart and what their senses told them, how the stars shifted, how the swells felt beneath the hull, and even the flight patterns of seabirds. Polynesian cartography throws out the Western rulebook. Who needs paper maps when you can feel your way across the world? Their approach wasn't about recording space for others to see. It was about living it, memorizing it, and passing it on through oral tradition and hands-on teaching. These charts blurred the line between science and spirituality. They were guarded by navigation schools, held sacred, and treated as family secrets. In a world where the ocean could swallow you whole, these maps weren't just tools for survival. They were lifelines, woven from rhythm, memory, and the wisdom of ancestors. Now, let's drift from the salt and spray of the Pacific into the candlelit gloom of medieval Europe, where maps took on a new role. As the ancient world faded and the Middle Ages dawned, maps began to swap out practical navigation for symbolic meaning. In Europe, cartography turned into a canvas for spiritual truths, not so much a guide for travelers as a way to reinforce what people already believed about the universe. Picture a monk hunched over parchment, ink-stained fingers tracing out a perfect circle. The TO map ruled European imagination from the early Middle Ages to the Renaissance. These maps showed the world as a giant O, divided by a T into three parts. Asia at the top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right. And what was at the center? Jerusalem, of course, because why wouldn't the heart of the world also be the heart of belief? The East always sat at the top, not north, since that's where the Garden of Eden was supposed to be. No one was using these maps to plan a road trip. They were theological diagrams, teaching tools that doubled as spiritual manifestos. Lands were labeled not with street names, but with the sons of Noah. And the further you got from Jerusalem, the stranger things became. Beyond the familiar edges, the world was crowded with monsters, dog-headed men, people with feet like umbrellas, even folks with faces in their chests. If you thought your morning commute was wild, try navigating a world where the unknown literally had teeth. But let's not paint all medieval maps with the same brush. While Europe was mapping the world with myth and metaphor, the wider medieval world was busy creating maps that blended observation with artistry. In the 12th century, the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi was commissioned by a Norman king in Sicily to create a map so ambitious it was engraved in silver and based on interviews with travelers, merchants, and sailors from across the Muslim and Christian worlds. This map, the Tabula Rogeriana, was practical, detailed, and, just to shake things up, put south of the top. Why not? In Islamic cartography, the world looked different, and orientation was a matter of perspective. Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions all joined the map-making party, but in their own unique ways. Indian and Tibetan maps often placed Mount Meru at the center, depicted as the cosmic axis, surrounded by continents and divine realms, a kind of spiritual traffic circle. These weren't navigation charts for sailors. They were blueprints for the universe, designed to show the order of things as much as their location. All these medieval maps, with their beasts and paradises, remind us that mapping is about more than plotting rivers and mountains. It's about encoding meaning, about putting your beliefs down in a way that says, here is what matters, and here is what I fear. In an age when the horizon held both wonder and terror, the map was less a tool for travel and more a mirror of the soul. As the centuries ticked by and the known world expanded, our urge to capture it only grew. People wanted more than just to get from point A to point B. They wanted to know who they were, where they came from, and what lay beyond the next bend in the road, or the next wave on the sea. Ancient maps, with all their wild distortions, sacred symbols, and gaps where the dragons lived, laid the groundwork for today's obsession with borders, precision, and digital navigation. It's not the accuracy that ties all these old maps together, it's the intention behind them. Babylonian cuneiform tablets weren't designed to help you find the nearest market. They were cosmic blueprints, showing the spiritual backbone of the universe. Egyptian maps helped tax collectors and priests keep the pharaoh's world in order, where every flood and field was the domain of a god. Greek maps introduced daring new ideas, scale, geometry, the belief that you could measure the world and make sense of it. Roman road maps stitched together a sprawling empire, letting legions, messengers, and the occasional runaway goat move from Spain to Syria. Chinese maps, ever the multitaskers, blended astronomy, politics, and the search for harmony between heaven and earth. Of course, the outliers are just as telling. The Polynesian stick charts showed that a map could be tactile, abstract, even invisible, a thing you feel, not just see. Medieval Mapae Mundi, filled with monsters and miracles, told viewers not only where the world was, but what it meant. Even the flaws and blunders in ancient maps are clues. They show us what mattered, where people placed themselves at the center, and what they were willing to imagine or invent beyond the edge of their knowledge. In the end, geography has never been neutral. Every map is a snapshot of priorities, power, myth, and memory. The Greeks put themselves at the center. The Chinese did too. The Europeans, naturally, thought they were the bullseye of the universe. Everyone, it seems, is the center of their own world. And now, with satellites mapping every pothole and pizza joint on Earth, you might think we've moved beyond all this symbolism. But the real urge behind mapmaking hasn't changed. We still need to orient ourselves in something bigger, to find our place in a world that always feels just a little bit too large. Whether you're looking at a clay tablet, an ancient parchment, or the glowing screen of your phone in the dark, every map answers the same ancient question. The one whispered at the edge of sleep, tucked in with every bedtime story and boring history lesson. Where am I?